there is a number that should make every single person in tornado country stop cold. $4. That is what the average American pays in taxes each year to fund the entire National Weather Service. $4. That buys you the overnight forecaster watching your radar at 2 in the morning when a supercell is spinning up outside your county. It buys you the electronics technician who drives out in a storm to restart the weather radio transmitter so the alert reaches your phone. It buys you the meteorologist in charge who has been running that office for 20 years and knows the local terrain well enough to know exactly which valleys flood first. For $4, you had a system that issued warnings for the most dangerous weather on Earth and saved thousands of lives every year. I'm Tyler, and this is Crisis Alert Live. Comment below where in the world you're watching from, because what I'm about to walk you through is not a story about weather. It's a story about a decision, and what that decision is costing people who had nothing to do with making it. In February 2025, the Trump administration's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, began cutting the workforce of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the federal agency that houses the National Weather Service. The cuts came in 2 rounds. Craig McLean, a former NOAA chief scientist, confirmed the numbers from sources with direct knowledge. One round of approximately 500 employees, a second round of approximately 800. Combined, that represents roughly 10% of NOAA's total workforce. Included in those cuts were meteorologists who do local forecasting and hazard warnings in National Weather Service offices across every state in the country. About 375 probationary NWS employees alone were cut in the first wave. And when you add up the firings alongside the buyouts and early retirements that followed, people who left rather than work in a system being actively hollowed out, NBC News confirmed the National Weather Service was down 560 employees by mid-2025. 560. These were not redundant administrators. These were the people who issue tornado warnings. Representative Grace Meng of New York said it plainly after the firings. These are dedicated, hard-working Americans whose efforts help save lives and property from the devastating impacts of natural disasters across the country. This action will only endanger American lives going forward. 3 months later, on the night of May 16th, 2025, a violent EF4 tornado cut a 60-mile path through southern Kentucky and killed 19 people. And the National Weather Service office in Jackson, Kentucky, the office responsible for issuing warnings for the exact counties that got hit, had no permanent overnight forecaster on duty that night. The New York Times reported this detail. Newsweek confirmed it. The gap existed because of staffing cuts tied to DOGE. Workers were called in on emergency surge from nearby offices to cover the shift, borrowing forecasters from other already stretched offices to fill a hole that should not have existed in the first place. Now, the NWS did issue warnings that night. Warnings went out, cell phone alerts fired. Thus, the system did not collapse completely. That is an important thing to say clearly and fairly. What the evidence does suggest is that the system was running on borrowed staff to cover a structural gap that should not have been there in the first place. And if you follow that logic forward, a worse night or a second simultaneous event or a storm that moved faster than expected could have produced a different outcome. But here is what the former meteorologist in charge for the Tampa Bay NWS office, Brian LaMarre, said to NPR after the Kentucky deaths. 8 offices across the National Weather Service were critically short-staffed at that moment. Many more were operating below normal capacity. And his word for that situation was not manageable. His word was a recipe for disaster when you look at the long-range forecast. He said, failure is not an option, but it is not sustainable for the long term. LaMarre had spent over 3 decades in the National Weather Service before taking an early retirement offer in the spring of 2025. He knows what sustainable looks like. He was saying, "This isn't it." The warning system for American weather is not just the alert that pops on your phone. That alert is the last step in a long chain of human work that starts days before the storm arrives. It starts with meteorologists at the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, who watch the large-scale weather patterns and issue outlooks. It continues with local offices who combine those outlooks with regional knowledge to refine what is coming and when. It runs through electronics technicians who maintain the Doppler radar equipment, so those estimates are based on real data. It runs through overnight forecasters who are awake and watching when a storm develops at 11 p.m. on a Friday in a community where most people are asleep. You remove people from any point in that chain, and the chain weakens. You remove enough people, and the chain eventually breaks somewhere on some night when someone needs it most. Rick Spinrad, who served as NOAA's administrator under the Biden administration, told PolitiFact directly, "Job cuts will result in reduced reliability of systems such as the weather radars that are critical for providing tornado warnings. Those radars rely on having a full staff of technicians as well as full sets of supplies for repair and maintenance. Weather balloon launches, which collect atmospheric data that feeds directly into the core of local forecasts, were suspended at 3 NWS offices in New York, Maine, and Alaska shortly after the first round of firings because there simply weren't enough people left to launch them." The NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory announced its communications services were taking an indefinite hiatus. DOGE also announced it might terminate the leases of 19 NOAA offices nationwide, offices that house critical forecasting and radar operations. And it doesn't stop there. NOAA's proposed budget for 2026 would close all NOAA research laboratories, including the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma, a lab that has been operating since 1964 and is directly responsible for many of the advances in tornado warning science that have extended warning lead times and saved lives over the past 60 years. The multi-radar/multi-sensor system, one of the primary tools meteorologists use to track fast-developing flash floods, is a project of that same laboratory. Climate scientist Daniel Swain at UCLA said the reductions would affect every single colleague he has across public, private, and academic weather science. These literally are the people who are responsible for issuing a tornado warning during a tornado outbreak, or a flash flood warning during a flash flood, he said. On July 4th, 2025, 6 weeks after the Kentucky tornado killed 19 people, a flash flood swept through the Texas Hill Country before dawn and killed more than 130 people, including 27 children at a summer camp on the Guadalupe River. The NWS office in New Braunfels, responsible for the warnings, had lost 22% of its staff. The office did have surge staffing that night. 5 forecasters instead of the usual 2 were working. Warnings were issued. But one NWS official told NBC News, speaking on condition of anonymity, that staff believed the Texas deaths strengthened the case for rehiring because of how clearly the season had demonstrated the system's brittleness. Whether the staff reductions directly contributed to any single missed warning is something that requires careful individual analysis for each event. But what the pattern of the summer suggests is that a system operating this close to its limits is one where the margin for error keeps shrinking. Brian LaMarre, after 30 years of forecasting some of the most dangerous weather in the country, said he believes the National Weather Service's people are the kind of professionals for whom failure is genuinely not an option. They will work extra hours. They will borrow staff. They will call in favors from neighboring offices in the middle of the night during tornado outbreaks. That professionalism is real, and it is documented, and it deserves to be recognized. But professionalism cannot permanently compensate for the structural removal of the people who make the system work. You can surge staff an office for one storm. You cannot surge staff 122 offices simultaneously across an active severe weather season indefinitely and expect that the gaps in coverage will never land on the wrong night in the wrong place. $4 a year. That was the cost of this system to the average American. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, the United States had a life safety infrastructure that was considered by most meteorological experts to be one of the best in the world. What it costs to rebuild what has been cut. In time, in expertise, in institutional knowledge that walks out the door with every experienced forecaster who takes an early retirement offer rather than work in a system being actively dismantled, is a much larger number than $4. This is Crisis Alert Live. If you're watching from tornado country, from Kentucky, from Texas, from anywhere in the central United States that relies on a warning system to give your family a fighting chance, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us whether $4 felt like too much to pay.